with respect to public involvement, a couple of changes to highlight. The most significant, I think, is that we have an existing notice of immediate response actions when you're doing response actions to address an imminent hazard or critical exposure pathway, in which case notice must be provided to owners and operators and affected individuals. We made a change in these amendments to have this apply not only when remedial action is being taken, which is how it currently reads, but also when assessment actions are being conducted at the point in which they confirm that an imminent hazard or critical exposure pathway exists. So this is to provide, better, earlier notice in those cases when some ongoing assessment work is being done that may or may not lead up to a remedial action, but that if this concern is being investigated, that notice be given. One of the changes we made in response to comment was suggested that we change the time frame for this notice to 3 business days, which we did. Another change to highlight, I think in practice, this may be what most of us are already doing in terms of providing written notices to local officials. I think during the pandemic, we had indicated that it was acceptable to send written notices to local officials by email, but now we have that change reflected in the regulation. Utility-related abatement measures through AUL areas. In the current regulations, when you encounter an AUL, a post-permanent solution, the vehicle that's available to you for completing the work is a release abatement measure. It has come up in cases where people are conducting URAMs, and those are going to continue on through an area with an activity and use limitation. That extra process of then filing a RAM plan and continuing the work under a RAM was not efficient, did not seem to really add value to the process. So we've made a change there to allow for that work initiated as URAM through an AUL area to continue to proceed as a URAM, provided, of course, it complies with the terms of the activity use limitation and those other provisions for post-permanent solution work. Remedial additives near sensitive receptors. We had proposed, we have in the regs, I don't know if it's 4.5 or 4.6. I have 2 different citations there. I think it's 4.6. So 40.00463. There's a list of criteria for when additional approval is required and an additional plan for applying additives in certain locations. And one of them is near sensitive receptors. And one of those sensitive receptors is application of additives near schools, daycares, or residences. The concern in those cases is a potential for volatilization as a result of applying additives to those nearby schools, daycare centers, and residences. But the current provision doesn't read that way. So the proposal was to make that specific to those additives that had the potential to volatilize to those cases where you were treating VOCs, or you had the potential to volatilize VOCs. So that would mean in cases where you're otherwise applying additives for solidification or pH changes, those types of things, near this sensitive receptor, that a plan would no longer be needed in those cases. We also shortened the presumptive approval timeframe for that plan from 30 days to 21 days. And we specified that the plan could be incorporated into whatever response action plan is associated with it, provided that it's clearly marked as being related to the application of remedial additives. So I'm going to finish up here. I think I just have a couple more related to activity and use limitation changes. One of them is the sketch plan, which is an existing component of an activity and use limitation, an exhibit to activity and use limitation. And it shows the area of the AUL relative to the boundaries of the disposal site. The amendment adds that the sketch plan also be used to indicate property boundaries and the location of any engineered barriers, permanent caps, exposure pathway mitigation measures, or other barriers or systems that are subject to the obligations and conditions of the AUL or other provisions of the AUL. One of the changes we made from the way this was proposed to the final is we had much more in terms of detail of specifying features of these different barriers on the sketch plan, and the comment which we agreed to was that kind of locked things in. Some of those features might change over time as changes were made to those systems, so that we not include that level of detail. So the final provision is less detailed than what is proposed. We also added back into the forms that a reference in that bracketed language that you select when you're implementing an AUL as to whether the remedy achieves a permanent solution or a temporary solution. We also added back in, or remedy operation status for the purpose of maintaining a condition of no substantial hazard. Other changes, there is now a new bracketed clause that is to be included in the AUL if it applies, if you're providing an exhibit with respect to signatory authority, that you have the document that supports that the person signing the AUL has the authority to do so. Where that is required, there is now this block to indicate that. And we also added to the Form 1075 the standardized obligations and conditions for AULs when they're used to support a permanent solution as part of an exposure pathway mitigation measures for a POET system on a private water supply well. And then in the section 40.1012, the list of when an AUL shall be used, shall not be used, and may be used, there are two additional requirements there. One is that an AUL is required for a permanent or temporary solution related to non-licensed site with radiation above background levels. So that ties back to that new adequately regulated section for radioactive materials. And the other is this actually implements something we currently have in the LNAPL guidance, which is to state that in the case of LNAPL, visible LNAPL, that an AUL would be required in those cases where the LNAPL is anticipated or is at a thickness greater than a ½ inch. So for those sites where the LNAPL is less than that, the AUL would not be required in that case.